If the body is apparently something that we call physical, and we know from these studies that the mind can affect the physical world, what happens to our body when our mindset shifts? There's much more potentially to reality than we've been taught. Maybe there is some form of reincarnation. Maybe there's even a soul.
What are the main ways that we've been misled as far as what our consciousness is?
There's an interconnectivity of consciousness with ourselves and everything else around us. Plants are a different form of consciousness, even though they don't have a brain. Working with a tree is a way of activating the memories, or even having the tree take on some of our emotions that might have been left in those memories. We've made a lot of inferences. When I say we, I mean the mainstream scientific community, academia. It's almost like as we grow and develop in this world, we become more disconnected from who we actually are.
Today is my conversation with Mark Gober, the author of 7 books in the Upside Down book series. Mark is a Princeton graduate who later found himself in Silicon Valley as an entrepreneur and now spends his time doing incredibly robust research and producing books that help us better understand the upside down world we find ourselves in, and a lot of the fallacies that shape the way we think about and believe what reality is. In this conversation, we talk about why medicine needs a consciousness reform, how things like out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, past life memories, and the ether can shape our beliefs about our health, our biology, and our reality. And perhaps most importantly, how do we actually know the things we think we know? I hope this conversation will lead you down a rabbit hole in the best of ways. I'm really excited to present this to you. Thanks for tuning in to Becoming Superhuman. Here is my conversation with Mark. Mark, I am so excited to have you here today because in your quest to understand what is seemingly an upside down world that we're all living in, you've authored 7 books that really break down some of the fallacies in our fundamental thinking around many aspects of reality. And I recently read your book, An End to Upside Down Medicine, Why Consciousness is Needed for a New Paradigm in Health. And when reading the book, it was one, incredibly well referenced and well cited, but very interestingly for me, you included a whole section on why consciousness is needed for medicine. You know, some of the ideas around consciousness that have really been removed from and intentionally obfuscated from anyone trying to study medicine and biology and understand the greater truths about who we are and what we are. And so a really interesting place I thought we could start off with today is, what are some of the main ways that we've been misled as far as what our consciousness is and how it influences our sense of reality?
We've made a lot of inferences. And when I say we, I mean let's say the mainstream scientific community, academia, mainstream media. And the inferences are things like our consciousness pops out of our brain. So consciousness is the part of us that experiences, and we know what the brain is. It's a physical structure inside the skull. And there's an inference that consciousness somehow pops out of it. No one's ever seen that before. Another similar inference is that when we get sick, there's a physical cause that we can point to, whether it's a microbe or a toxin or something that we can physically see at some level, even if it requires a microscope. And that's what's causing physical symptoms in our body. But when we look at the actual studies that have been done, oftentimes we can't actually come up with a physical cause or a single cause. So the point here is that there's much more potentially to reality than we've been taught. And the reductionistic thinking of mainstream medicine, which wants to bring things to a single physical cause, might not always capture what's happening, because there are other reasons, potentially, reasons that science doesn't currently understand or acknowledge, spiritual dimensions of reality, the power of our own mind, those sorts of things might impact our health more than people realize. And I'll give one example that I like to reference. Anita Morjani, she was dying of cancer. She was in a coma, had tumors all over her body, and entered into a near-death experience state. So an altered state of consciousness where she encountered her deceased father. She had realizations about her own way of thinking and how she could change the way she thought about herself. And when she was resuscitated, her tumors disappeared within a few weeks. So she shifted her consciousness somehow. Maybe she even resolved conflicts in her consciousness, and physical symptoms that would have otherwise killed her went away. That sort of healing, for example, is not accounted for in mainstream medicine, and yet it's extremely powerful because we're talking about something that seems to be non-physical, very much affecting the physical body.
Yeah, this is of personal interest to me. I've spent a lot of time recreationally studying these types of metaphysical experiences that not only people have, but a lot of research has been done around. And what I've come to realize is that the space of consciousness research itself it's actually incredibly robust, and it's just not mainstream. And so these experiences, you just mentioned the experience of a near-death experience, out-of-body experiences. These are things that people will talk about and will claim that they've, experienced another dimension or accessed another dimension of reality that in many cases seems just as, if not more real than physical reality. And you talk about this in your book, but would you like to speak a little bit to that aspect of consciousness and how it not only influences, but in many ways very much shapes what we deem reality, which for most people is our physical world?
Well, I want to go back to the first inference that I mentioned, the inference that consciousness is just something that pops out of our brain. And if that's true, then consciousness it's known as an epiphenomenon. It's not something that actually affects the physical world. It's just a byproduct of biological activity in the brain. And therefore, we wouldn't think that consciousness would have an effect on the world itself. Number one, consciousness isn't physical. We can't point to it. We can talk about it in the abstract, but it's really not a physical thing. It's purely subjective. So the idea that this subjective thing that we can't even point to could affect a physical thing that we can point to, that is outside of mainstream thinking. But if we regard consciousness in a new way and say that maybe consciousness is beyond the body and our brain and our body more broadly, they are interfaces for consciousness. And the body's like a vehicle or a vessel. And that consciousness, even further, might be a fundamental aspect of reality. So when we start moving in this direction, the idea that a shift in consciousness could shift physical reality, it makes a lot more sense. Because let's say consciousness is the substrate of all reality. Everything that we call physical isn't even actually physical. It's just a manifestation within our consciousness, which I know is a very difficult thing to reverse engineer in our mind because we're so used to considering a world that's fully out there. But when we actually dive down into our own experience, everything we ever experience is within our own consciousness. So that opens new possibilities. And there's a whole body of science that points in this direction, even if we don't know exactly how it all works. For example, the science of psychokinesis, where a participant in a study, and these were done at Princeton, for example, and many other places, where a participant in the study is asked to try to influence the behavior of a machine. And the machine is called a random number generator, sometimes called a quantum number generator. But basically, it's a machine that will generate numbers in a random fashion. And if it's ones and zeros over a long period of time, it will generate 50% ones and 50% zeros because it's totally random. In these studies, a participant is asked to try to make the machine behave differently, to produce more ones than zeros, for example. And the way the participant is asked to do this is not by touching the machine, but rather by using the mind to try to influence it, which under mainstream science, that makes no sense. Because again, how could that happen? If consciousness just pops out of our brain, it's not affecting the physical world in any way. It's certainly not going to move outside the brain to affect something outside of us. That doesn't make any sense. But what happens in these studies repeatedly is that the machines start to behave non-randomly when people try to make the machines behave differently with their mind alone. So it's a statistically significant result. there are also studies, it's called the Global Consciousness Project, which spun out of Princeton University. Dr. Roger Nelson, Brenda Dunn, and Dr. Robert John at Princeton initially was working on this sort of thing. But the machines are set up all over the world. So most people don't even know they're there, and they're generating ones and zeros all day long. What the experimenters do is they look at what the patterns of ones and zeros in these machines during, just say, normal times in the world versus major global events like 9/11 or Princess Diana's death. The idea being that if there's a major global event that shifts collective consciousness where a lot of people are emotionally involved and focused on something, then maybe that will have an effect on these machines, even if the people don't know the machines are there. The hypothesis is that when collective consciousness shifts, that affects the physical world in ways that we don't ordinarily perceive. And sure enough, what these machines do is that they behave non-randomly when there's a major global event. The Global Consciousness Project studies this. So these are just examples. They're called micro psychokinesis. They're very small but highly statistically significant effects. So it's not as if the machines are all of a sudden producing 100% ones and 0% zeros. It's a deviation from 50-50 chance that's beyond what statistical randomness would predict. So there's something happening. And if we apply this to thinking about health and to the nature of reality more broadly, what's the power of the mind? Because if the body is apparently something that we call physical, and we know from these studies, and there are many others like it, that the mind can affect the physical world, then what happens to our body when our mindset shifts? That takes us in a totally new direction, which mainstream medicine doesn't consider.
Right. And in your book, you talk a lot about this, the idea of what can happen in the body based on what's happening in the mind or what's happening with someone's level of consciousness. And as far as what we can create, that can look like health, it can look like disease. And that's how powerful we are, is that we have the ability to create either or within, what we term this physical body. But in your work, you just mentioned that consciousness has never actually been found to come from the brain. So what does mainstream science say about what consciousness is, or how do they try and explain it into the fabric of reality?
Well, there's a clip of Neil deGrasse Tyson, the famous astrophysicist, who said that, well, we're having a really hard time understanding consciousness. Maybe it doesn't even exist at all. I'm not sure if he meant that literally, but that's where some of the scientists go, which is that this is such a big issue. Maybe it's not even something that we can understand. But I would say most of mainstream scientists, neuroscientists in particular, they will say that consciousness comes out of the brain. We don't understand how this happens exactly, but the reason they believe it is because of correlations between brain activity and conscious experience. In other words, if a person damages a part of the brain responsible for vision, and then they have a corresponding change in their eyesight, we can say, look, you affected this part of the brain, your consciousness changed in this way, therefore the brain is what's creating your conscious experience. And the reason that's not necessarily true is that it's a logical fallacy to say, oh, those two things are correlated to each other, therefore one causes the other. We need a lot more research to understand what's causing what. For example, if we naively looked at a scene of a large fire and we saw lots of firefighters there, we could create a whole story about how the firefighters created the fire. When in fact, we know firefighters come to a fire to put out the fire. So we could look at the brain and consciousness like this. What if the brain is certainly involved in our conscious experience? And that's why we see these correlations in neuroscience. But maybe the brain is like an interface and a filtering mechanism or an antenna receiver. And consciousness is well beyond the body and the brain is tapping into it. So it would be like if we're watching television and we take a hammer and smash the antenna on the television set, and all of a sudden the TV show that we're watching, it appears scratchy on the screen. It's not because the signal was damaged. The signal's fine. The only thing that changed was that the apparatus responsible for interfacing with the signal, for receiving it, that was damaged, the antenna. So what if the brain is something similar to that? But if we want to go even a step further and not even talk about the brain for a moment, there are many cases of people who receive organ transplants and they take on the personality traits or even dietary preferences or sometimes memories of the person that they got the organ from. So we're not even talking about a brain now. but something put into the body from another living being, and those characteristics are transferred from one person to the other. What's going on here? All of this suggests that our mainstream understanding of consciousness is probably not what we think. And it leads us down a road of what some would call spiritual. And that word can be triggering in the mainstream academic community, because I know this from my old way of thinking that anytime someone said the word spiritual or religious, I would immediately think superstition, and that we have transcended that with our science. And so that's off limits, basically. So when we talk about these phenomena that are repeatedly occurring, combined with the fact that we have no idea how a brain could create consciousness beyond these correlations, which don't tell us anything logically about causation, that there might be a spiritual reality to existence that we just have to acknowledge. And if that's true, that means there's a lot more to life than meets the eye. And we have to incorporate that into our thinking about health.
You just mentioned the word spiritual and said that it can be triggering. I know in your earlier life, I mean, very conventional and impressive background, but you went to Princeton and then you went out into the world and started working, and it probably could have been very easy to continue living that very conventional life. And I would say for myself, I come from a similar background where, I went to dental school. I did a lot of research in undergrad. I was an atheist. I was very, very much programmed to orient myself towards incredibly conventional scientific thinking. And it wasn't until I started getting into more theoretical physics that I opened myself up to what I would now call the, spiritual realms of reality and those possibilities. But can you speak to a little bit now how your worldview has changed from what I would imagine was probably much more materialistic to, wherever you may see the nature of reality now? And do you believe that there is this spiritual, I'll say, fabric to our reality, or this thread that sort of weaves throughout all of us that connects us?
Yeah, I certainly was more of an atheist agnostic previously. In other words, I would have said to you that when our physical body dies, that's the end of our consciousness, because the only reason consciousness exists is because of biological processes inside of our skull. So, of course, when the body stops functioning, that would be the end of consciousness. No afterlife. And I also would have said that because consciousness just pops out of our brain, then it's stuck inside of our skull. It certainly cannot be traveling in terms of space and time. It's not going to affect the physical world. So I was in a mindset that said that everything in life is random and meaningless. And the only meaning that exists in life is something that we're making up in our own mind. It's not actually there. There's no meaning built into the fabric of reality. And after having studied these phenomena over the years and gotten to know many of the scientists themselves, for example, I'm on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, where Dr. Dean Radin is the chief scientist. And I had a podcast series called Where is My Mind in 2019, where I got to interview many of these scientists. And the more I dive into it, the more I realize, okay, there's reality to this. And therefore, I have to reconsider my worldview, that maybe there is more to life than I was taught. And it could be that academia, or let's just say mainstream academia, is wrong about this stuff, meaning that they are missing an entire segment of the nature of reality, that they're focusing on just the material, which might be a limited sliver of a much bigger reality, could explain why there's so many things we don't understand in mainstream science. And when we get into certain phenomena of physics, like you were alluding to, the notion of quantum entanglement, for example, the idea that there are two things that seem like they're far away in space and or time, but they're interconnected in some way. What's the mechanism by which that's happening? There is this field of quantum mechanics. There's also, I would say, growing opposition to that among some other people like Dr. Stephen A. Young, a theoretical physics PhD, who's wondering whether it's not actually quantum. There might just be a background ether, some kind of medium that's connecting everything. So it looks like the two things are far away, but they're actually part of the same medium. And that's why they appear to be interconnected. Whatever the explanation is, I don't know. It's pointing to something that is more than meets the eye. And that means there's so much more to reality potentially than we can even conceive of. I mean, we're really limited by what we can perceive with our organs, which we know the spectrum of light that we can see is tiny compared to all of the light that scientists know about. So right there, we can say there's a lot that we're not perceiving on an ordinary basis. But there might be other elements of reality that we can't even conceive of because of the way that our mind works, that we like to think in linear fashions, like the materialist perspective, or some would call it the physicalist perspective of reality, would say that when we get down to the smallest elements of reality, it's like there are these subatomic particles and then quarks and subquarks, which are like little billiard balls, and one hits the next, hits the next, hits the next. And it's this linear process of how reality works and how causality works. But what if it's something way different, where there's a metaphysical component to all this that we don't actually see? So we don't know exactly why everything's happening, or maybe it's not happening in a linear fashion. What I'm trying, hopefully, to do for your audience is to open up the realm of possibilities here beyond what we're ordinarily taught, what we ordinarily perceive on a daily basis. There might just be a lot more.
And on a personal level, have you had an experience that you would describe as spiritual or metaphysical, like some sense that there is this greater reality that is, purely unseen, energetically based?
I would say my experiences have been somewhat mild. Like, I haven't had a near-death experience, or some people in meditation, they'll enter another world. For me, it's been more, I've encountered people who have had those experiences, so that's impacted me. When I've heard enough accounts from independent people who have very different backgrounds and they're talking about the same thing, that's powerful. I've also had a lot of synchronicities where things will happen, or the same, like, seemingly random thing will come up over and over again. And when I just run the numbers in my mind, it's like, okay, that's beyond anything that is happening by chance. There's some meaning happening here, and I can't put my finger on it. I'm not going to write a scientific paper about it, but it's happening. Or I've experienced other people who are having metaphysical experiences, like people who have psychic abilities or energy healing capacities, or channeling, for example, when they're invoking a being from another world who speaks through their vocal cords. And this has been studied scientifically. Helene Wabe from the Institute of Noetic Sciences wrote a book called The Science of Channeling, showing that many of these instances are not just people who have psychiatric disorders, that they're pulling in some other energy. And that's why they speak in a different cadence or use words they're not usually familiar with. Sometimes what happens is that when researchers put a random number generator in the same room as a person who is allegedly channeling, the machine will start to behave non-randomly, which is suggesting that some energy is entering the person. So I've witnessed people do this. And so for me, these are like maybe indirect spiritual experiences where I see it happening, but I wouldn't say I felt the oneness that I've heard so many people talk about. It's been much more of an intellectual exercise combined with talking to a lot of people.
Yeah, you just mentioned the Institute of Noetic Science. And what's interesting actually is, so they just put on it was a large scale research study for out of body experiences. It ran from over the last 4 days. So it just finished yesterday. And I was a participant in that. And it was led by Jade Shaw, and she is a well-known out-of-body experience facilitator, I would say is her title. And so she led the workshop. But in that 4-day time period, I had 2 experiences, very unexpectedly, but 2 experiences of being out of body and really connecting to a sense of being that was quite literally not attached to my physical body. So I've had in the past other experiences kind of like that, like through meditation, through different, breath work or energy work. But it was really interesting to one, be a part of a study that was done on a large scale, and it was digitally or online and involved people from all over the world. So that was one interesting, but also to hear very similar experiences, like everyone had a unique sort of expression of whatever it was that came into their awareness, but there are common threads that people who have these types of experiences have. And so this is one way, this is an anecdotal form of evidence, but, very, very real or very true in the sense of giving us some idea of what is possible and how we connect to this realm that is, beyond what we consider physical reality. And I think just talking about these things and acknowledging them and giving credence to them, which you're doing, but that in and of itself is building the awareness, but also the truth. And that's a hard word to use because I won't claim that I know what the truth is, but I do know that it goes far beyond what most of us are taught or most of us are told. And so, yeah, this idea of just building these fields of knowledge, fields of belief, and Rupert Sheldrake calls these morphic fields, but the ideas that hold reality together are just as real and just as powerful as what it is itself, like reality itself, because this is how we live the experience of our lives is through our beliefs. So I just wanted to share that because you had mentioned ions, and I think it's kind of relevant for this conversation being something that I just came out of.
I didn't know that. That's a synchronicity. But these out-of-body experiences, let's say for a skeptic, they might say, how can you verify that happened? Like, you can tell me all you want that you were out of your body, but you can't prove it to me. There are cases, they're called veridical out-of-body experiences, where the perception from out of body is verified upon returning to the body. And there are cases, especially in near-death experiences, when the person is in some kind of physiological trauma versus, let's just say, a normal out-of-body experience exercise where a person's fully healthy and just trying to send their mind somewhere. In a near-death experience state, the person might be in cardiac arrest. So they have little or no brain functioning. Sometimes they're clinically dead. And yet, upon being resuscitated, they talk about how their mind was outside their body, hovering on top of the operating table, sometimes even going to another room and seeing and hearing things. And then when they come back and they're resuscitated, they tell the doctor and family members the things they saw and heard from that vantage point, which the doctors and family members can verify because they were not sick. They were in a totally normal state, and they can say, well, okay, how did you get that right? Because we know we can actually timestamp when that memory occurred, when that perception occurred from out of body, and what the person's body was doing. We can say, look, this is what your brain was doing. This is what your heart rate was. And wait, how could you be outside your body seeing and hearing things at that time? Those are very difficult to explain with conventional models. And to me, they give a lot of credence to the out-of-body experience. Not necessarily every allegation, but in those cases, you have a verified memory at a time when the brain is barely functioning or completely off. Therefore, we have something happening from outside the body that is non-hallucinatory. Because if it's verified as accurate, by definition, it's not a hallucination. And therefore, we can't say, oh, well, it was just a hallucination because the brain was dying. It was giving off some kind of chemicals and it made you hallucinate something. No, these are actual perceptions. So it again suggests that our consciousness is not tied into our body and that maybe our body's actually limiting our consciousness. And somehow when we do various exercises or have a near-death experience state where the brain is knocked out completely, our consciousness is liberated. And so our body and our brain, it could be like a blindfold that actually holds back our consciousness in a way. And sometimes when consciousness is liberated, it can do and perceive all sorts of things that it normally doesn't. Like in a near-death state, people will report 360-degree vision, or people who have been blind since birth, they're able to perceive. And then they come back in their body and they go back to being blind, just as an example. So again, these are expanded ways of thinking about our own experience that don't even rely on physical biology.
Have you listened to the telepathy tapes? Are you familiar with the telepathy tapes?
I am. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the kind of common themes throughout the telepathy tapes is that these children who oftentimes don't have the ability to verbally communicate or have a lot of motor control over their body, so in a way are somewhat dissociated from their body, have these extreme abilities. So, telepathy is just one of them. But precognition, remote viewing abilities, the ability to pull information from the field, the universe, whatever term you want to use. But it just speaks to what you just brought up, that this idea of the body perhaps being almost limiting in a way as a tool for us to use as a crutch to experience the world, because it does give us as far as we can tell, really immediate, very seemingly real feedback. And through that, I think because it's not something that we practice, these, extrasensory abilities, it almost seems like we have lost, or we have been programmed to train out of ourselves the ability to sense beyond just this physical body.
I agree with you. We're certainly not trained that in mainstream schooling, for example. We're not trained or even taught that we have these abilities. And it seems that children are very tapped in. For example, there is work done at the University of Virginia, their Division of Perceptual Studies at the med school. They've studied over 2,500 cases of young children who are able to remember a life that is not their own with very specific detail. And sometimes the researchers can find historical records that validate what the children say. Sometimes the children even have birthmarks and physical defects in their body that correspond to the way they claim to have died in this alleged previous life. And the researchers can find a medical record validating it. But often what happens is the children, as they get older, the memories start to fade. And I'll give another example. Dr. Edith Ubuntu Chan, who was at Confluence, where I spoke recently in Bandera, Texas. It's a festival put on by The Way Forward, Alex Eck, Molly Engelhardt, and a bunch of others. Dr. Edith Ubuntu Chan had a number of children on stage who could read with a blindfold on. Not only could they read, but they could do and solve Rubik's Cubes with a blindfold on, and they could play chess with a blindfold on. So she and her colleague, they can teach children how to do this using visualization and guided breathing, where to them, it's not even a big deal because they seem to be more tapped in. So it's almost like as we grow and develop in this world, we become more disconnected from who we actually are.
Right. And I mean, going back to some of the things that you talk about in your book that are very physical, like it almost seems like we are living this really, really backwards, archaic structure in a lot of ways. But I'll speak to medicine specifically. But, this idea that we can physically manage everything, like you can medicate everything, you can vaccinate everything, you can test everything very empirically. And there is this, management perspective that is reductionist, and it does really break us down into these, just fleshy, bony beings. And it's like a whole other aspect of who we really are. And there are lots of different ways that this is sort of postulated, but there are many researchers that talk about the different bodies that exist within us. So there's the physical body, there's the out-of-body experience world. We'll talk about the astral body, the subtle body. So all of these different bodies that sort of make up the biofield, or this energetic being that science does acknowledge. Like we understand that we are electromagnetic beings, but what that actually means for how do we understand ourselves? How do we heal ourselves? How do we treat ourselves? Do you think that there is sort of any in the conventional space, I'll say, movement towards more of a mass understanding of these things, so that for people who are still in that world where, a conventional or a more mainstream approach seems like that's where they still are, there's some access to understanding around any of these other things?
I mean, part of me is slightly optimistic because of developments like the Telepathy Tapes podcast, which went to #1 on the Spotify podcast charts ahead of Joe Rogan. So that's a big deal. I mean, I remember when my podcast, Where's My Mind, came out in 2019 on very similar subject matter. I interviewed Dr. Diane Powell, who studies autistic savants back then. So I think there is a lot more momentum now than there was even a few years ago. But then I look at what's happening in academia, and I know many of the scientists who have had to leave academia because you're not allowed to talk about these things there. That there's just too much taboo around it. And people will say, well, maybe get tenure first, and then you can talk about it, and you'll still be demeaned by your colleagues, even though you have tenure. So like that cultural shift, the big cultural shift has not happened yet, which then leads us to a lack in funding. Because in order to study these things and to get the level of let's just say, scientific validation that many people require, that means you need a lot of funding and a lot of different scientists over many years doing independent replications of these phenomena to show that they seem to be real. And that's just going to take time. So for a while, there will be an ability for the skeptic to say, okay, that sounds nice, but show me decades and decades of studies validating this. And maybe we can point to a few of them depending on the subject matter, but we don't have the same level of research that we have for other areas where there's just so much funding being pumped into it. And for that reason, I think it depends on basically what someone requires as a standard of proof. For those who are interested in this topic, there's a lot of science out there, which at least for me, there's too much to dismiss all of it. But we don't have the same level of independent replications for certain phenomena that we do in other areas of more mainstream science. And for the people that require that, they may just never have it in this lifetime. And that's why I think it requires, for those who really want to go into this stuff, departing from the mainstream and looking at what some of the other scientists are doing and being open to the fact that maybe we're not going to have the full body of scientific research that's needed, but we might have a few studies here and there, and we might have a lot of anecdotal evidence among practitioners who are doing this stuff all the time and working with the biofield. For example, Eileen McCusick, she was also at Confluence. She works with tuning forks to help people with their biofield and to feel into what might be out of balance. And this is something that she teaches other people how to do this. She can help people in their own health and their own psychology using this. So while that might not be a controlled double-blind study in the way that everyone would want, there's practical application to it. And so it does require just sometimes leaving the mainstream and coming to our own intuition about what's real and what's not.
Yeah. And I think, to go back to the morphic fields idea that, as I said earlier, the more energy, the more thought, the more time and investment goes into these types of things, the bigger these fields grow sort of on their own, like they take on their own energy. And I think being in somewhat of a conventional place myself as I practice as holistically as I can, but I'm still a dentist. And I do think that there are people, generally speaking, that recognize that the system that currently exists isn't serving them. Like they don't necessarily know what the alternative could be, but the mainstream systems that we have, the educational system isn't making people smarter. The medical system isn't making people healthier. The financial system isn't making people wealthier. Like there are just all of these ways that reality seems to not be working in the ways that we were told it was supposed to work based on the systems that we find ourselves in. So I do think that there's some openness now, and maybe it's always been there. It's just my awareness of it now has changed, but there is an openness to understanding these aspects of, what is real, and what is upside down, and how do we reorient those things so that, life and our experience here, it actually works out the way that we would hope it would, and that we have some agency over that versus, being victimized by, all of the ways that the deck is stacked against us. I think one thing, and I don't know if you have any experience with this or commentary on it, but I'm interested to find out, is I think that a lot of it has to do culturally with how we view things in the West versus the East, as an example, because I've recently come back from Southeast Asia, and there's nowhere that's perfect on Earth, but their understanding of the non-physical realms and their connectedness to some form of spirituality, spiritual understanding, and then integrating that into their life, like on a day-to-day basis, where there is this deep connectedness to spirit in whatever way they feel and understand it. It's pervasive. It's everywhere. Like in Thailand, you go to a bank and there is a shrine in front of the bank. You go to a clinic, a medical clinic, there's a shrine in front of the medical clinic. And so outside of religion, there is just this very deep understanding of a connectedness to one another and a connectedness to spirit or to a universal presence that is helping to direct the existence of each of the people there. And that was to live amongst that for a month or so. It was a very different feeling than coming back here to the Western world where we are so far removed from that and so materialistic.
There's a different understanding about how reality works in those cultures because there's a more pervasive view that there is an intelligence, a consciousness, God, whatever you want to call it, that's guiding life rather than thinking that the human being is in control of everything and has to micromanage every aspect of reality based on what we can perceive and run a controlled double-blind study on versus so much more being out there. So I do feel like there's an expanded view of reality that allows people to live with different priorities and a different compass almost. Basically, the orientation for living life shifts when there's this expanded perspective that, yes, we do appear to exist in a body, but we're within this container of a much broader intelligence. And maybe there's even a soul. And if we believe some of these studies with young children who have memories of another life, maybe there is some form of reincarnation, however that works, where there could be a lot more to our existence than we can even remember. So for example, some of the studies or some of the case studies of children that have these memories of another life, the children also have intermission memories, meaning they have memories of a period between lives before they came into their current body and even choosing their parents. So like, what is the deal with that? If we start to go in that direction of like, what amnesia do potentially all of us have? And just that possibility starts to open up a lot of new thinking and a new way of living.
And you said that was the University of Virginia that's done
Yes.
that work? That's amazing. I had never heard of that. 2,500 children. Yeah, that's amazing.
And this started in the 1960s, Dr. Ian Stevenson. And so that because he was such a prominent psychiatrist back then, this organization has been allowed to persist, the Division of Perceptual Studies. But typically in mainstream academia, this sort of thing is not allowed to be studied. But they study not only children who have these memories of another life and trying to verify the children's memories, which in some cases they do. They also study near-death experiences and mediumship and other phenomena, which all point to the idea that consciousness is well beyond the body. And the implications of that, of course, are very immense. And I think I like to mention the University of Virginia because it's so rare to hear a credible organization like that. To use the word reincarnation and University of Virginia in the same sentence, most people wouldn't think about that. I mean, Dr. Ian Stevenson, one of his books is called Where Reincarnation and Biology Intersect.
And do you know of any other mainstream universities or large-scale organizations that are very openly doing this kind of work or doing large-scale studies like this?
It's more one-off scientists. I mean, I mentioned the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is an independent organization. I also mentioned Princeton University, the former dean of engineering, Dr. Robert John, had a lab for nearly 30 years. The Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, which was looking at the effect of the mind on physical matter, remote viewing, which is the ability to perceive something with the mind that's far away in space and or time. So the US government has used this in the past for psychic spying, and there are declassified documents that validate that this is a real phenomenon. Princeton was studying that. So beyond that, I've heard of some individual scientists doing it. There is a little bit more funding these days. For example, an organization, it's all publicly available, called Emerald Gate, that is funding studies on energy healing and phenomena like that, of what are the energies that might be non-physical that we don't typically think about in mainstream medicine that can actually affect the body and heal people. There is more and more of that, but I will say I think we're at the early stages of this. Even though with the telepathy tapes, there's more momentum and interest and hopefully more funding, I think we're very early in the West, at least.
And with your research, with the medical system as it is right now, and then also you really dove deeply into the ideas around consciousness and a lot of that research. Do you feel that, one, there is a place for what conventional medicine has to offer? And two, do you have any ideas of how these things can be merged so that, there's maybe like more of a weaving of one into another rather than this complete separation of these two worlds.
I discussed this a bit in the introduction to my book, An End to Upside Down Medicine, that the allopathic approach is very good at handling emergency situations. Let's say emergency surgery, or someone has an injury and you just need someone to get better. Something that's very acute. It handles that well. To me, the problem is when we apply that acute mentality to general health. Because if someone comes in with an emergency injury and the doctor's goal is just to make the person better so they can get back and they can work out again, or that they can even live, that's necessary in that situation. But if we're looking at health more broadly, often we're looking at what are the determinants of health and disease? What are the root causes, rather than just trying to eliminate and eradicate symptoms? Because sometimes a symptom is telling us something about what the body needs or what the body lacks, or maybe something about even the soul. Maybe it's teaching us that the soul is not on the right track and it needs to shift, and someone's mindset needs to shift. We could come up with a lot of hypotheses about why a symptom is there. And if it's not one of these acute emergency situations, maybe we need to try to get to the root cause rather than just put a Band-Aid on something. So that's how I look at it, that there's a lot more that needs to happen in terms of the psycho-spiritual aspects of health and disease, even looking beyond just microbes, because there's a lot of focus on the germ theory of disease, but looking at things like toxicity, diet, looking at the electromagnetics, EMFs, electricity, looking at those things that mainstream medicine doesn't think about quite as much. And then also having the emergency capacities for acute issues. That's at least how I see it. But we're really so far from that because of the allopathic system, which became entrenched in Western thinking starting in 1910. There is a Flexner report, which was supported by the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, which moved health and teaching about health, medical schools, for example. It moved us away from holistic thinking, more toward this allopathic thinking, which is all about, let's just get rid of the symptom. Let's think about it from a reductionistic perspective where we can try to point to the one thing that caused the symptom and let's just eradicate that and not think any further, versus something more holistic, which is getting to the root cause and looking beyond reductionism, looking at the potential psychospiritual aspects in addition to the other things I mentioned.
I won't mention any names, but many years ago, I was speaking to a physician and I asked him, he's a family practitioner, I asked him, do you know how to make someone healthy? And he said, no, I know how to tell if somebody's sick. And that was just very much an acceptable answer for him. And also, I think kind of the pervasive paradigm in medicine is whether most physicians actually really overly think about whether they know much about health or not. I think the focus is identifying disease. And, as you just said, the management of disease comes from this perspective of, how do I just get you to a place where maybe you're able to walk around versus, how do I understand who you are as this holistic, complex being that has, many influences that could be responsible for what you're experiencing right now versus, if I give you this pill, I think you'll be able to walk around for the next little while.
In my book, I quote Dr. Sam Bailey. She's a traditionally trained doctor in New Zealand. And she says that we have a sick care system, not a healthcare system. It's a very different mentality.
Yeah. In your research, I would imagine, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine you've probably come across a lot of things that, opened up your eyes or changed your worldview on specifically medicine, but consciousness and understanding the body and understanding, how we experience life and the influences that really affect us. So do you have, what are the things that you look at from that perspective and say, this really blew my mind? And I think if somebody is looking to open up their mind as far as health and well-being, this is something that they should look at.
My first thought is the work, again, at the University of Virginia. Some of these young children who have a memory of another life, you can see in their body the physical defects, birthmarks that are sometimes strange, that correspond to the death of a person who died in another life. There's an example I show in my book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, a girl who claimed that she died in a previous life where she was murdered and she was tied up in ropes. And you could see that the shape of her leg in this life had indentations naturally as if it had been tied up in ropes. That was the physical defect in the body. And there are many other examples. I mentioned where reincarnation and biology intersect by Dr. Ian Stevenson. What he says is that in traditional medicine, doctors are taught that there are two things affecting our physical form, our genetics and the environment that we're in. What happens in these cases of young children who have birthmarks or physical defects that can't be explained by normal means is that there's something that's not genetic and it's not environmental. He said there must be a third factor. So that right there, that there could be an entire other category that affects our body. And maybe there's a fourth factor and a fifth factor. I would say that's a really big one. And then also looking at the role of our mindset on our health. Because often, like I said before, we're so trained to think about physical causes of physical symptoms, but we don't take the time sometimes to track, well, what's going on in my life right now? When did these symptoms start? And if you actually take the time to like journal, whether it's from the perspective of German new medicine, for example, which depending on the condition, sometimes after the conflict has been resolved, a person has symptoms. It's almost like the body's flushing out all the reserves that were needed in order to handle the psychic conflict. And then the person resolves the conflict and then the symptoms emerge as the person is basically clearing all that stuff out. It's an adaptive mechanism. That would be a totally different way of looking at a symptom, for example. Or in other cases, let's say the symptoms actually correspond with a stressor in life or something that a person had a really hard time dealing with or felt isolated in dealing with. These are forms of, in German new medicine, a conflict shock, where you feel isolated in dealing with it. You don't expect it to be there. It's distressing. My point is to try to get really granular with what's happening in my life, what's happening in my mindset, how am I perceiving events in the world? Because it's not just about what happens, it's how we are taking that in. Like we could both perceive the same event very differently. For me, it might be stressful. For you, it might be nothing. But getting in tune with our own psyche, that can be a revolutionary thing in thinking about our health. Because sometimes I find this for myself and many people I know, sure, diet's important and sure, we want to avoid toxins and all that stuff. But if our mindset is in a very distressed place, those other things don't matter quite as much. And getting really clear on what are our patterns of thinking or even our subconscious beliefs that are so grooved in and deeply interwoven in the fabric of our psyche, we don't even realize it. So it's that inner work that I think is very foundational.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've very recently started attempting a lucid dreaming practice. So I have not had a lucid dream, but what I have been able to do is my whole life never remembered my dreams or very rarely remembered a dream. And in being very intentional about this practice, so going to bed each night and saying, tonight I'm going to remember my dreams. I'm going to be able to recall my dreams. I've been able almost every single night that I've said that in the morning to then wake up and write something down. And my point in that is that is just a practice in understanding the subconscious mind, because when you are not lucid dreaming, when you're just dreaming, which we all sleep and we all dream, and when you become intentional about taking note of that, there also, you bring this awareness to your subconscious mind and what messages is it sending you? What experiences is it trying to direct you or orient you towards? And in understanding the subconscious mind, which drives the majority of our thoughts, our beliefs, our behaviors, it also brings more awareness to what's happening consciously, including our ideas about health, our ideas about about disease, our beliefs about how we can, upgrade or downgrade ourselves. And I think that that understanding of the subconscious is this unlock to different realms. Like we've talked about OBEs and near-death experiences and, these really profound things that no doubt have, in my opinion, just as much of a realness to them as the physical reality. But I think just like a very easy first step for probably most people is evaluating your subconscious mind. And our dream state is a really accessible place to do that because we do that all the time, every night.
Right. Think about how many hours of our life is spent in the dream state that we're not even taught to focus on. I recently did a retreat with Joel Schaefer. He's a shaman in the Toltec tradition from Mesoamerica, and the dreaming arts is a huge part of what they do. And actually, we practiced what are called magical passes. They're movements with the body that bring you into a dreamlike state. And then also recapitulation, which is going back through memories and breathing in energy from the memory that we left there, that was ours, and then breathing out what we took in that's no longer ours. And apparently this brings us to a state that gets us closer to realizing that this waking state is actually a form of a dream. It's very real, but it's also a dreamlike state. And then when we're asleep at night, that's a different realm. So it's almost like there are these different dimensions of experience, each of which has a form of reality, but also a dreamlike quality to it. And what Joel will say is that there are other realms of reality that are much realer than this one, even though they're all real. I'm not an expert on this myself, but I think you're onto something really important of like being aware of where our mind is and then taking more agency over it and being able to not just be victims of the mind, but actually allowing our mind to control reality and controlling the mind in the process.
Were you able in that retreat, were you able to go back through some memories and like feel into the feelings of those memories? Like, do you think you were able to capture some of the things you maybe left there that you picked back up?
Absolutely. I remember a lot of memories were reemerging that I hadn't remembered. And that's what Joel says is what happens when you recapitulate is you start with one memory that pops into your mind, but the more you do it, other memories that you're totally forgotten about, they'll just reemerge. And the way we were doing it was actually in nature with trees and trying to like, because in the Toltec tradition and even from just a broader perspective, like plants are a different form of consciousness. Even though they don't have a brain, there's something there. And so the idea is that working with a tree is a way of activating the memories or even maybe having the tree take on some of our emotions that might have been left in those memories. So actually aiding in the recapitulation process was something that we tried to do.
I did a long time ago. I went to the Amazon, the jungle, and I did with a group of people. We did a clinic there for the local tribes, and they have a plant remedy for everything, like anything and everything. And we went on a journey with a shaman one night. So he's kind of listing off the different things, including, remedies for toothaches and dental infections and, all of these things that we think about treating by drilling and filling. They have plant remedies for. And I asked him, how did you come up with this? Like, how do you know what to use and when to use it and how much of it to use? And he said, and I'll never forget it because it was so powerful to me. And it was very early on in my journey and understanding some of these concepts that we're talking about. But he said, if you listen, the plants tell you. And I understand that in a very different way now, but just speaking to what you said, there is definitely a sentience and a consciousness to plants and the natural world. And, I think that's another thing that the more we tap into the subconscious and these, external realms that go beyond what we consider the physical world, you gain access to these other dimensions of consciousness that exist beyond just human consciousness that also have information and messages for us.
Well, in my book, An End to Upside Down Medicine, I mentioned the work of Cleve Baxter, who used to do lie detection for the CIA. And one day he decided to hook up his lie detector to his plant to see if it would respond. And it wasn't until he had a real intention, I'm going to burn this leaf, that he was actually going to do it. The lie detector spiked when it was hooked up to the plant. So for many years, he was then experimenting with this. And I'm remembering one example he mentioned in his book, I believe it's called Primary Perception, where he had his plant hooked up to the lie detector and he went miles and miles away to a friend's surprise party. And he came back and he saw a spike in the lie detector. And it occurred at the time when there was a big surprise at the surprise party. In other words, when his own physiology was aroused, the plant was somehow connected and responsive to that miles away. So it was a non-local connection. And this, to me, is in alignment with everything else we've talked about, that there's an interconnectivity of consciousness with ourselves and everything else around us. And again, that's not something mainstream science or medicine would normally consider, because they'd say, oh, well, that thing doesn't have a brain, and therefore how could it be picking up on energies? But to me, that perspective is limited and really naive, because it leaves out this broader reality that we're speaking of today.
I suppose the last thing I'll ask you about here is, and maybe you don't have a clearly defined answer, and that's okay if you don't, but what do you think, there's all of these different terms, the Akashic records, the field, the universe, God, source, like all of these terms that kind of identify or speak to the idea that there is this connectedness within the universe that binds all of us, that holds information that we can tap into, that we can access these quote unquote supernatural or superhuman feats of knowledge from. And they're all a little different and a little similar. But do you have, with all of the research that you've done and the experiences that you've had and, testimonials that you've come across, do you have your own thesis on what this is? Like, what is connecting all of us and where are we tapping into?
Well, I would say right now, and this is all just hypothesis, that there's some unifying field. Ether is one that I've looked at recently, which in ancient times was known as the fifth element and was basically taken out of physics in the late 1800s because of the interpretation of certain studies. And my most recent book, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos, explores how maybe those studies were misinterpreted, which has led us astray in physics, where now we don't even have a unified theory that can reconcile the two leading theories, which are gravity and quantum mechanics. They don't work together. And we've had to say 96% of the universe is dark matter and dark energy, basically plugging them in because our physics is wrong. And that's a much longer discussion. But it leads us to what I mentioned earlier, Dr. Stephen A. Young, a classically trained theoretical physics PhD, who's saying that we need to bring back this notion of ether as some kind of a spiritual interface. And everything that we call matter or even light, they're just different excitations of the background medium. So from this perspective, we could say that light isn't even traveling. It's just that it's being sequentially excited in the background medium. And when we excite this medium at different frequencies, we get different types of matter or light or energy. That's just a framework to think about reality. And maybe there are even layers to it. Maybe it's multidimensional and there's different parts of the ether or layers of it that we access, and some would call that the Akashic records. I don't really know how it works, and it's probably so much more complex than we think about it. But if, let's just say, consciousness is the basis of all reality. Like Max Planck, a Nobel Prize winning physicist, he said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. So we live in this sea of consciousness that we're a part of. Dr. Bernardo Kastrup says that we're whirlpools within a stream. So we're the sense of being an individual, localized body of water, but we're all interconnected as part of one consciousness. The manifestation of that one consciousness into the physical world, it could happen through the medium of ether, or maybe a layered ether or something. And then we experience a physical world. So that's how I like to think about it now. And that framework can accommodate many of the phenomena that we've discussed, but it's probably way more complex than anything that we know about or even can talk about.
Yeah, agreed. I think the more you dive into this, the more reading you do about it, the more experiences you have with these, metaphysical aspects of existence, the more you just realize that you probably don't know all of the things that you think you know. Like, it just, each time I open myself up to something different or something new, I understand and I'm sure of a little bit less. I'm more open to more and sure of less. So I think, I completely agree. I don't have an answer for anyone as to what this place exactly is, but it's far more nuanced and complex and beautiful, actually, than, what most of us have been taught to believe.
Right. And mysterious. I totally align with your own experience that the more I've learned, the more I feel like I really don't know what's going on. I'm finding myself asking questions about everything. I'm like, well, I was told this is true. How do I actually know? And then what I find repeatedly is that as we pull back the assumptions of, well, we believe this because of this thing, but actually that's an assumption. And that assumption came from this, which came from this, which came from this. And if you take it all the way back, you realize that the assumptions are based on very shaky foundations and nearly if not every discipline of thinking, which now makes me ask myself, well, what is it that I haven't questioned yet that I should be questioning, both in the world around me, but also within my own belief systems and my own belief structures?
Yeah. And I mean, what you did really well in the book, An End to Upside Down Medicine, and I'm sure have done in your other books, is, breaking down the fundamental thinking to what medicine is, like the conventional ideas around medicine, and just sort of, blowing up these ideas that most people just assume are correct. Most doctors, most researchers, most pharmacists, like most people holding the systems together, assume that there are correct ideas and proven, factually evident ideas that hold these things together. And when you actually really dive into them and start doing your own research, it kind of falls apart. Like all of these ideas, as you said, they're on very shaky ground. And in some cases, they're entirely made up.
Yes. Often what I'm finding is that people confuse an observation for the cause of the observation. So they'll maybe see something happen in a lab or the world around us, and they'll say, oh, that happened, therefore this is what caused it. It's like going outside and seeing that the grass is wet and concluding that it rained, because it's true that rain can explain wet grass. But there are many other reasons that grass can be wet, like sprinkler systems or dew, or probably a million other things that we could come up with. But people will see something and they'll say, well, I can come up with a model that can explain that observation. Therefore, that model is correct. So you could have a model that can adequately explain something that is also an incorrect model of reality. And that happens everywhere, especially when we're dealing with microscopic things, like anything in microbiology. So much of it is based on what's happening in a laboratory setting outside of an organism's body, and doing a bunch of tests and seeing things happen in test tubes and then concluding, well, this is why it happened. Same thing happens at the cosmic scale of, well, we observe this light, and if we assume this, this, and this, we can come up with this kind of a Big Bang model that explains all these phenomena celestially. But just because that one model can explain it doesn't mean there aren't other ones that can explain it too. So it's known as affirming the consequent, a very important logical fallacy where people will constantly jump to causal explanations for something they observed rather than considering other ones. So it's like, I see this effect, therefore I know the cause. Is that true? Like an apple falls to the ground. We know an apple falls to the ground because we can all replicate that. But is that because there's a mystical force called gravity, that the mass of the earth is what's causing that thing to come down? Or is there another reason? We really have to ask these questions about everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll share this one last thing, like just kind of on the same topic of, mass assumption. But dentistry, the whole premise of dentistry is based on germ theory. So it's this idea that bugs cause disease, like bacteria cause cavities, they cause periodontal disease. All of the dental diseases that you can probably think of are caused by germs and bacteria. And pre-COVID, I was working with a company and we were running PCR amplifications. And what we were trying to do is we were trying to see if these PCR amplifications could identify patients who had certain dental diseases. And what we were actually finding was, we were getting control samples and we were getting samples from patients who had, whatever disease we were investigating at the time. And our amplifications didn't make any sense. Meaning that we had healthy patients that had, we were pulling bacterial profiles from healthy patients that should have been diseased, and vice versa. So patients who clinically had a certain disease and should have had a certain profile, and they didn't. And what it showed me at that time, it was frustrating because I thought, I've been told this story about dentistry and bacteria and how they affect you and how they cause disease. So why are we not seeing that? But the other thing is that in that world of research, it became very clear that, depending on where you're doing research and where the funding is coming from and what the motivations are, there is a tendency to skew things or to maneuver things, you massage the information that you get so that it'll reflect a certain outcome. And I think, the COVID era was a good example of that. But also just, what it really made me realize is that all of these things that we think we know and that we believe are facts deserve to be questioned and deserve to be, analyzed in a way where you don't presuppose that anything is an absolute given. Because, with your work and a lot of the things that we've talked about today, that isn't a fair assumption. Like, we can't just decide that things are facts unless we actually know that to be true. Because a lot of what we consider factual is, unfortunately has been made up by somebody who benefited from that story.
Right. Like, I think bacteria, that's a good case where we can see that there are a lot of bacteria that emerge at the site of what someone would call an infection. But what we don't hear people asking as often is, well, why are there so many bacteria there in the first place? What happened? Did they just magically appeared and they're out there to kill everybody? Or there's an alternative perspective. It's known as the terrain model versus the germ theory model, which is that the bacteria appear because they're helping to break down dead and dying tissue. And certainly it can become a problem when there are too many bacteria. They can emit endotoxins and they can cause issues. But maybe the bacteria wouldn't have been there in the first place if there wasn't an underlying toxicity. It's going back to the firefighters and the fire analogy. It's like maybe they're firefighters that are helping to put out the fire. In nature, we see that bacteria are saprophytic, that they break down dead and dying tissue. They have that innate capacity. So hopefully this is for your audience, just opening minds to say, okay, we observe something. A person is sick and we see bacteria there, but does that tell us about why the bacteria are there? And therefore that gets into clinical questions, which I'm not even going to go into, of how would you think about treating the person. But we have to get to root causes and understand why something is happening first. And just by observing something, that doesn't tell us everything. All we observe is a lot of bacteria there. This person's having symptoms. And it's like we need to become more objective in the way we look at the world rather than superimposing a reason. Or let's say a bunch of people go to a party and several of them get sick with similar symptoms afterwards. And many of them will say, I went to the party and I caught something. And the word caught is superimposing a cause as to why the symptoms were there. And okay, that's one idea, is that there was a bug that went from one person to another, even though no one observed that at the party. But maybe there are other reasons. What were other common things that people were exposed to? Common toxicity. Maybe there was food poisoning. Maybe there was a similar emotional stress. Maybe in the same way that one person yawns and another person yawns, or women who cohabitate, sometimes their menstrual cycles will synchronize. That's not a physical germ going from one person to another. They're not catching it. My point is that we have to be creative when we think about causality and be very objective of, okay, they went to a party, a few people had symptoms, and these were the symptoms, rather than just saying we're going to presuppose the cause. And it takes more mental energy to do this because we can easily get locked into the common assumptions in society, but I think they often lead us astray.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I could talk to you for hours. So just to wrap up here, is there, we've kind of covered a lot, but is there anything that you would like to close off with? Any thoughts that you have before we end today's conversation?
My last thought would be to summarize. If we're told something is true, first reaction is, okay, how do I know that thing is true? What is the series of pieces of evidence and the set of assumptions that lead you to this assumption or lead you to this belief that you're telling me is true? The more and more we can do that, the better off we're going to be, because that will allow us to get to the bottom of the many falsehoods that exist in life. And if we want to do that on an internal basis, like the work of Byron Katie, if we have a belief about ourselves or about someone else, to actually ask ourselves, is that thing true that we think is true? And what happens repeatedly is we realize, actually, we don't know with certainty that thing is true. To me, there's only one thing we know with certainty, which is at this moment, it feels like I'm having a conscious experience. And everything else after that is some degree of inference. It might be an inference that we're comfortable with, like that our conversation was still happening 5 minutes ago because I have a memory of it and it feels very compelling, but I actually can't validate it because anything that I will perceive, whether it's a video of it, is something from the past or a memory. It's something that I think is from the past, but it's occurring in the present moment. If I watch the video, it's occurring in the present moment. There's nothing that I can truly validate beyond my feeling of being conscious right now. So having hopefully that intellectual humility will allow us to question many, many beliefs.
Yeah, I love that. The idea of intellectual humility. Well, Mark, thank you so much for today. Thank you for sharing your mind with me today and just engaging in this conversation that to me is very important because it opens up this window to, what is reality and what are some ways that we can approach thinking about that go beyond where we are right now, because that's kind of what we need to do for the advancement of our who we are and the betterment of humanity and creating a world that really reflects all of the beauty and possibility that is within each of us if we allow it to be expressed.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your open-mindedness, especially given your training. I have many friends who are dentists, and I know the kind of training that goes into that and the hard work, but I really appreciate that you're open to asking so many questions.
Thank you.